All right, so what I want to explore today is the broad term would be this capacity to be alone. There's a British psychoanalyst, not that long dead, who was extremely influential in Great Britain and has come to be more and more so in the United States, in taking some of the original psychoanalytic thinking and applying it more broadly and more deeply, and even if not directly saying so, making important connections between what can happen in the psychoanalytic process and therefore what undermines psychoanalytic theory, and also the realm of the sacred, the numinous, and the spiritual. He himself was a practicing Anglican, and his name is DW Winnicott. And he was in a way Britain's answer to Dr. Spock. Oh, so not the one on Star Trek. So that's always a caution, I have to think, because many younger people will only know of that one. And I would say, of course, that he was also more sophisticated. His training was different. And he continues to be an exciting person for those of us who are looking at this intersection of psychology, psychoanalysis, and spirituality. So I'm quite taken with him and his ideas. Last year I gave a set of retreats on the capacity to believe. And so this year I'm giving a couple of talks on another one of his capacities, the capacity to be alone. He's got about 6 or 7 of these. And though he never really talked about it in this way, these capacities could be looked at as a way of gaining a sense of both the psycho-spiritual well-being of a person. Not so much like diagnosis, but where are people within these different capacities? And our capacities begin when we're very young, but it's not a one-way movement. It's not just, continuing getting better on all things. What in life is, except the aging process, and that's only numerical, because the way, what age we might feel versus the age we are, that changes. Lori is, 46, and some days she feels 72, and others 21, and we all have, I think, some of those same kinds of experiences. Question often comes up, well, do we really need to bring that psychoanalysis in? Because really, that was Freud, wasn't it? And he was just really thinking mostly about sex. He thought a lot about sex, but that's not all he thought about. He did have a fairly narrow vision, but after all, he was the first one to start. So we take it that that's the beginning, but it clearly isn't the end. So Winnicott is part of a small group of people who were not quite so heavily connected with Freud himself. And some of these other folks in England and Scotland were really at quite a remove from Freud in his immediate presence, because he started off in Vienna and then moved to London. So these folks could take the theory reflect on it, on their work, and then rework it really in quite a different way after Freud's death. So these folks are called members of what's known as the British School of Object Relations Theory. Bad use of words. Objects refer, in this case, to people. So object relations means what are these relations that we have with people. The difference is it's not the same thing as interpersonal. It's not limited to our interpersonal relationships. It involves very heavily these psychic presences that build up in our unconscious, in our minds, over the course of our childhood and our lifetime. And these objects, as they're called, are representations of the people who have been most important to us in our lives. And these are not 100% objective, and that's an important thing to remember too. If you think of your own memories, or if you talk with family and friends, or with your children, where something happened, and you're very clear about what happened, and you talk with them about it, say something 10 years ago, and you're not really surprised to hear that they have quite a different take on it, right? Well, so that happens all the time. And when we're in the world of the unconscious and the world of the mind, there isn't a one-to-one correlation. So we have a number of intrapsychic relationships with our moms. So there's more than one mom in there, usually. There's the mom that was always taking and making sure everything was right for you. Then there's the mom who you experienced as withholding and mean-hearted. Then there's the mother or father who you experienced as depressed and silent and distant. And then there's the parent that you experience as having been almost destroyed by your own anger. And so it goes on. So we have this inner theater of objects and relationships. And I do believe that if we can take some of this and apply that to our own spiritual experiences, we're going to gain an additional depth of understanding, and we're going to do our part to eradicate this sort of fallacious and unnecessary split between, let's say, psychology and spirituality. The therapeutic field, when I first started back in the 70s, there still was that sort of split. And when I went into my doctoral training program in the mid-'80s, I was quite, I don't know what I was. They were all surprised. They couldn't wait to meet me because they heard that there was a monk coming into the program. They'd never had that before. And then this woman came up. She was a couple of years ahead of me in school. She was what they used to call in those days a fallen away Catholic. And she came up with, with a little bit of fire in her eyes. And, well, I can't wait to see what happens to you and your religion when you start your psychoanalysis. And I said to her, I can't wait either. She just looked at me. Needless to say, I was psychoanalyzed, and I'm still here. So I'm at least one person who can, testify that there doesn't have to be this division. And I think there is this movement these days that we really are looking to take the fragmentation that we experience and bring it together and make sense and come become whole. The only caution is that we're going to break apart again, but then we bring it back together again. But that won't be the same way it was before, okay? But this is part of the process. There's a German philosophical term, I don't think I pronounce it right, but it's something like this, Verreichenheit. And it's translated roughly as torn to pieces-hood. So, I forget which philosopher it is, but this is part of the human condition that we suffer. It's endemic to us, torn to pieces-hood. I like that. And what I like about psychoanalysis is that it's not afraid to get in there and talk about dirty, messy things, which is what's going on within us many times. One of the lines from one of the Pope's recent speeches, I'm not going to quite get this right, but he wants a church that is dirty, bruised, and messy. You know, he wants people to kind of get in there. I think in our spiritual lives, that's what we want to get in there too, because we have these, more than inklings, we have this really powerfully deep sense of something going on. As a physicist, and I'm going to just change his quote a little bit, he has this phrase, and I'm going to change here, so mine is better than his. Someone is doing I don't know what. He actually called it something, because he was talking about actions in the universe. But really, he's not hinting at it, he's saying very clearly, there's this mystery, but it's profound, but it's something that we just know to be true. And for us, it's this God of ours. For others, it's talked about as a numinous experience or some other way. But we don't know what's going on, but we know something is going on, and we know that somehow this is extremely powerful. And this is what drives us to look into ourselves. There's another British writer, and he writes interesting things that are not just meant for the psychoanalytic community. So you might find some books of his and you might enjoy them. He's quite a good writer. His name is Adam Phillips. In fact, I can give you the title of one of his books, because he has an essay in there that is on risk and solitude, which relates to our capacity to be alone. And the book is called On Kissing, Tickling, and Being Bored. Psychoanalytic Essays of the Unexamined Life. He's a good writer, and he says some very provocative things, including this. Someone asked him, well, why have this interest in psychoanalysis? He says, human beings are always struggling to find a language for what matters most to us. What we suffer from or what we suffer for, and how and why we take our pleasures. So he immediately this isn't an intellectual exercise, is it? He's already taking it down. And I just, this next line here is related to that torn to pieces-hood idea. There is just something unmanageable about being a person. And that we are too much for ourselves. Certainly our family and friends know that there are times when we're too much for them, but you also, as you reacted before, we are too much for ourselves much of the time. There is, as he puts it, an excess of feeling, and we are caught up in the impossibility of our desires. Psychoanalysis, and so many other things. In fact, he says that too. Is psychoanalysis the only thing you can do to address these issues? He says, no, of course not. You could use aromatherapy, or any other number of things. So he's not saying this is the only way to do it, but he raises the questions, and then I think from our own experiences we decide how we work with that. But one of the things that therapeutic process does, but it's not just a therapeutic process, the spiritual process with another person is also very much this. We learn to speak and to listen to ourselves and each other. If you've ever had to take a communications class, one of the things they tell you is you really have to listen before you speak. And they'll often remind us that someone's talking, we're not listening, we're getting our speech ready because we know what we want to say. It doesn't matter what they're saying. So that's an issue. An early psychoanalyst, kind of a radical, at one time friend of Freud, he had this profound belief that if people could only speak differently with each other, they could change the world. And aren't there plenty of other people who are saying that more and more now? Yeah. Yes. So, related to this is different ways of knowing. When Freud started what he called the science of psychoanalysis, he really wanted it to be a science because that was the gold standard. And if you started doing things that weren't whatever scientific meant to him, you were in trouble. That's still an issue for the field of psychology today. Certainly there are aspects of psychology. Physiological psychology is a clear example that are very scientific. You can do all those same kind of experiments there that you can in physics. But when you're talking about the work between one person and another, it's a little different. I remember one of my supervisors, I forget quite what the nature of the discussion was, and he says, you need to remember that there are different ways of knowing, different kinds of knowing. So there is the scientific method, he said, but there is a psychoanalytic way of knowing. And then it's always stayed with me, and I thought pretty early on that, there's a monastic way of knowing, there's a spiritual way of knowing, there's a Buddhist way of knowing. Very interesting writers, in fact, Epstein is one of them, who writes on the interface of psychoanalysis and Buddhism. Quite interesting. So that's what we're about here, this knowing and finding language. Not that we're going to master ourselves, we never do that, but we can come to a greater understanding. And we can come to find some new ways of listening to ourselves and to speaking with others. So that's just kind of the broad background here. Now, this capacity to be alone, this is a pretty significant movement in the psychoanalytic field, and of course connects with the long spiritual tradition, and very much with the Camaldolese tradition, with our threefold good of solitude, community, and mission. Here's a few quotes from other people who've thought about this. It isn't as though Winnicott's the first one to talk about the importance of aloneness or solitude. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, all of humanity's problems stem from humanity's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. I had, some years ago, was able to spend some time with a Buddhist psychologist, and he was talking about what he noticed with people when they went to Lake Tahoe. Most of you have been there? Okay. So he said, so they get there and they look at the lake for about 10 seconds, and then they want to go do something else, okay? And he said, but what would happen if they just sat there and just kind of attended to that lake, that huge body of water, the depths of that? He said, they'd be overcome. He said, that's why they don't do it. And he says, when people come up to your place, he said, some people can do well there and others can't take it. And that's true. A friend of mine from Bakersfield, her husband came, and about 25 minutes was enough for him. And he really never came back. But the psychologist was saying, and this would also fit from a Jungian standpoint, because you're bringing these powerful images of mountain, sea, water, wilderness, forest, the numinous, all in one place. So that's an awful lot, and that opens things up and that stirs things up. So learning how to sit quietly is important. That doesn't mean, it's not the same thing as just being alone. If you follow blogs or you read things in the newspapers, there's a movement called, solo living. We live by ourselves, but we're connected. But I'm not sure how much solitude is experienced in that solo living. And not everyone's capacity to be alone is as developed as it may need to be if further growth is going to take place. So, in the quickest of summaries of how this works, the infant is born and is initially alone, and at this earliest stage, Winnicott talks about this experience is one of being incommunicado, just because there are no relationships built yet at this point. But over time, through these repeated relationships with the mother, the father, and other people, the internal stage over these years, it starts to build up. So it's interesting because the capacity to be alone begins with this sense of being incommunicado and alone. But what's really going on? Well, there are persons and an entire environment there that are actually caring for the infant, right? But the infant has no knowledge of that. You can easily make a connection between that and what's happening at the spiritual life as well, right? So we may think we're all on our own, but we don't have sometimes, maybe initially, this broader sense of being supported, by God, and we have just no knowledge of that. We think we're just all to ourselves, till something happens that breaks that open. But the development continues. So the infant and then the child starts to develop this capacity to be alone. So initially a child wants to clam on to the mother all the time, or the parent, usually the mother. But then as they get older, like 15 or so,
Starts at 11.
They run in the mom's lap, and as soon as mom picks them up, then what? Put me down, put me down. Yeah, okay. So that goes on for a period of time. And then another stage that takes place is then the child runs up and holds on to mom's dress or legs or pants for a little while. And at this stage, mom isn't even aware that the kid's hanging on or not, She's doing her work, she's talking to friends, and, there's this kind of sub-life of children that take place. I remember this from my own youth at my grandmother's house when all the aunts and uncles and the cousins would get together. And so they're kind of up here with their cocktails and cards and talking, and then all these rats down here are just doing all of this stuff. And we didn't care what they were doing, and as long as it didn't break things, they weren't concerned with us either. But it is to say that these things happen, and we're just not always aware of it. Then we get to this other stage where the child's in another room, and then calls mom, and you say, what do you want? And the child says, nothing, you know. So what's happening at each of these stages is that there is this buildup of this internal image of the mother. So the development of this is that we have the capacity to be alone, and in this way we're talking about not being in the actual presence of the person. But why can we do that? Because we have internalized the presence of the person. And that is the kind of thing that sets us on our way to continue to work on being at peace and being comfortable with the being alone. So I always bring a lot more than I am going to talk about, but that's just sort of how it goes. I'm always over-prepared. Just as it's important for any child, and as a child grows throughout life, you know, to be good at relationship development and maintaining relationships with others, right? The same thing goes for solitude. We actually have a relationship with solitude. We have to develop that relationship. We have to grow in that relationship over time if it's going to be something of greater value to us than just a brief escape from the tensions and noises and pressures. That's one of the things that we talk about to men who are considering our life. And then we watch for this very carefully. Some of them, oh yeah, I've lived alone. I'm real good with solitude, they say. And I just look at them. And I don't say, you don't know what you're talking about. But probably doesn't know what he's talking about. And this was especially true when we would get men, and Daniel, you'll remember this, about 15 years ago, we had an influx of people. They just couldn't wait to be recluses, completely separated from people. None of those people remained. None of those people remained. It's a lot harder to experience a real fruitful solitude than people think. But so this capacity to be alone, this capacity to have a relationship with solitude as a way of listening to oneself more, which is what happens, things do come up when you sit by yourself. So in our brief rule, it begins, sit in your cell as in paradise. Well, maybe that's paradise lost, huh? At the beginning. Because it isn't always. And when people talk, well, I had a desert day, but it didn't go so well. And I would say, well, what do you mean it didn't go so well? My mind was, all this stuff came up, and I would say, sounds like a good desert day to me. And then sort of explain what happens, that this is the sort of thing that does happen. But what we're striving for is we want to make this connection between what's happening at this, spiritual level with our psychological selves, is that this productive solitude can have a very particular experience. It can be what might be called a Sabbath point for that deepest part of the person. We often talk about the word soul, but I don't like just to use that. I think I'd rather talk about the person. That the solitude allows for developing and again maintaining a relationship with this, needful, very alive Sabbath rest. So we are in a period or striving to experience holy peace versus the holy frenzy that we often find ourselves in when we are busy about many things. And what we begin to experience is, in this spiritual realm, the same thing is taking place as what took place right after birth. The child really was never alone, right? There were people always watching, supporting, keeping the temperature right, changing nappies, all of that sort of stuff. Well, it's the same thing in the spiritual quest. You know, we're entering into this solitude, and so we're alone, perhaps physically, disconnected from social media and other things. But at the same time, as we are working to engage with this, we begin to feel this sort of diffuse background or deep layer of support. It's all-encompassing, actually. There's a sense of infinity about it. And some people talk about it as like a raw infinity. So again, this is speaking to the numinous, to this experience of God that is not so clearly defined. Because these experiences of God that tend to be clearly defined are the sort of the gods we create, right? So this is how we make God. Anna Maria Rizzuto is a psychoanalyst, Argentinian originally, and devout Roman Catholic. And she's written numerous articles and a book about this. And people would complain to her, well, the church, gives these young children all these bad images about God. It's the church's fault. And she would look at them and she'd waggle her finger. And she says, no child goes to church for the first time without having his or her own God under her arm. The idea being that God is a cultural image, right? People talk about God all the time, whether you go to a church or not. Children hear people talking about God, even if they're only swearing, But God comes up, and so children, we all try to put things together, to make sense in a world that often doesn't make sense. So we have to, and that's true for all of us. All right? We've all come to our experience of God with a sense of God that we've constructed. And so I guess I would say that, like in my psychoanalytic process, that would be part of it. As you work on these sort of issues, the God image comes up sometimes. Certainly for me, that's a large part of my life. So, but that's not necessarily God. So what could happen is, then there is no God, right? And then you have people that take flight in that direction. Or the other question is, wow, this is interesting. So what is God like? And who knows that, right? So, but it opens us up. But what's crucial about making this step in this movement towards a productive solitude and a productive aloneness is that there is a sense of support, and in fact an unbounded support, and a non-judgmental support that allows us to do what Winnicott uses this term, the process of going on being. He makes a good distinction, and again, this is not unique to him, between being and doing. So he has a quote that goes something like this: being and doing, yes. But first, being and being done to, and then doing. So this isn't like some kind of a dichotomy, like if you're a contemplative Camaldolese monk, well then we just be. You know? Or if you're one of the extern brothers who's the treasurer and IT man, then I'm the doing, you know. No, we're always caught up in this. But it's not just the being, it's also being done to. And that is the process whereby we let ourselves, and we choose to do this, okay, to be used by other people. Now, again, you have to really understand the meaning of the words as we're talking about them here. How many of you are or have done spiritual direction of some sort? Yeah, a fair number of you. How many of you had what I will broadly call like helping relationship conversations? How many of you have had kids? Okay, so being and being done to. So this being is this, if we think of that in the context of this capacity to be alone, we're in this productive solitude, okay? And we're at least unconsciously still deeply connected, but that's in the background. We develop our awareness of this sort of Sabbath point, of this sort of center. And what comes from this also is our capacity then to hear other people differently. So when we let people use us, that's what the infant is doing. So when you have to put aside, for the sake of theory here, and remembering that there's a psychoanalytic way of knowing. So when these little infants are scrunching up their faces and they're screaming and their fists are flying, some of the writers, that's the destructive behavior where the infant is destroying the withholding mother, okay? So this is theory, this is not actual life, all right? But what you will understand, especially with your experience of adolescence, is that adolescents, they have to destroy their parents with some regularity, psychically, okay? The fighting, the yelling, the sullenness, the not talking, the piercings, the tattoo, all of these sorts of things. This is that sort of destructiveness. Younger kids do it, it's just not quite so obvious, all right? And we don't really give that up as life goes on. We still have these sort of destructive behaviors. But, don't you find a way, you don't like it, but you tolerate it, don't you? Especially you think of adolescents, you have to give them some space to be this way. That's when you allow yourself to be done to. When you're working in a helping relationship, I've had this experience a lot in working with some very disturbed people who are deeply depressed. There was a way in which I would end up unconsciously holding their lost sense of hope, okay? So patient, would vilify me and everyone else, why do you have any of, there is no, that sort of thing. So it wasn't like allowing myself just to be stepped on like a doormat. There's purpose behind this, okay? And so we do this purposely. And so this is like a life approach in 2 sentences, okay? Being and doing, yes. But first, being and being done to, and then doing. So what he's saying here is and the capacity to be alone and the solitude are crucial to develop our capacity to be, and from that we then have a capacity of being done to. So what that means, and you can think about this for yourself as well. Sometimes with kids, something happens and then you do something, right? You go right into the doing. You're reactive. And sometimes that's what you need to do. Okay? But other times, kids are doing something, but you don't react immediately, right? Just you let them yell and holler, whatever. Okay? And then something can happen from that. Then, at that point, the doing is different than from just the reactive doing. You see that? The same thing happens in spiritual relationships, and I think in spiritual work as well. Many people, they just don't know what to make of. Again, it's because God is not whatever we think God is. So how could God let that happen? Well, try and answer that one, right? Mm-hmm. Or when someone says, well, God never gives you anything more than you can handle, you'll pay a price for saying something like that, okay?
Very decisive.
Yeah. So, yeah, you'll be literally torn to pieces when you say that sometimes. So, what we find is that all of this to say that this growth in our capacity to be alone, this growth in our capacity to be, and this is greatly facilitated by our building this relationship of solitude. It is something that it's a presence in a way. And I think it can be helpful to look at that. Loneliness would be what folks experience when it's not a presence, when it's an absence. So this is the difference then between solitude and loneliness. So I want to be clear just how this is, they're just not the same thing. And also, just because at some point, we've got a pretty good relationship with solitude, does that mean we're not ever going to be lonely? No, remember, it's not one of these sort of things, it's not something that you can't go back on, like a porcupine, this thing, no. You can slide right back down pretty quickly if you want, or if you need to. All right, let me... Oh my gosh. So, I want to give you some of the paradoxes associated with this notion of being alone and solitude. So, as I said at the beginning, this infant is alone, yet supported by this unknown group of people and the environment. There is this initial sense of this being incommunicado, but at the same time completely connected to others, but totally unaware of it. And this, again, gets played out in adolescence. I don't need you, Dad. I don't need you, Mom. I'm fine on myself. Can I have my allowance early? You know what I mean? It's simply like that, too. We need both things in our lives. We need, and this, you can think of this just from a psychic standpoint, but we have other needs here, too. We need these solitary moments because it helps to reduce the tensions. Not just the physical tensions, but the psychic tensions that build up. And we need these connections with others in real life, and exploring and maintaining and building up these inner ties for a sense of liveliness. And this is the greatest paradox of all, but it's so true. We are alone, but always in the presence of another. So it's, from a purely psychological standpoint, it's just that we have this theater of the mind that actually is alive and psychically real for us. We desire to be alone. We fear being alone. We desire to be with others, and we fear being with others. So we're back and forth on that. But even the capacity to be lonely, which is not the same thing as the terror of extreme loneliness, which some people have, who've had a really tough life, especially early on. To be psychically alone is for some people, such a terror and cataclysmic event that they do many things, one of which is a movement towards addiction as a way of handling that. But to engage in this real productive solitude, but another important level of functioning is to recognize when we are feeling lonely, because that's another relation. We have to have a relationship with our loneliness as well. And this only comes about when we bond and relate with others, and when we share in this new language that I was talking about. We have to find ways. Yeah, I'm almost done. We have to find ways of sharing our experiences of aloneness, and the way that that leads us into healthy relationships. And I'll say this last one, which I've hinted at, and I will pick up on this after we have the Eucharist, that a variety of companions inhabit our alone space and time. And who and what might these be? Well, God's in there somewhere.